Welcome to the Sense of Hope podcast by One Life. I'm your host, Helen Diveston. Today we are speaking to Kate Berridge. Kate has been a nurse for over 30 years and is Aotearoa New Zealand's most experienced bariatric nurse specialist. Kate started working in metabolic bariatric patients in 2007 when she helped set up the Counties Manukau DHB bariatric surgical service. In her time running the service, she worked with thousands of patients, but she could see that most needed significant emotional and mental health support after surgery, which wasn't available. In 2016, Kate left the DHB to complete a master's degree. Her master's focused on how to be successful in life after weight loss surgery. Her findings now form a significant part of the framework for Te Aki Whaiaro and its patient care service. Kate is a passionate advocate of whole person health and aims to enable individuals to develop their own self-care strategies so that they can lead the healthiest life that works for them. Welcome to the Sense of Hope podcast, Kate.
Thank you.
Kate, I was wondering if you could, for starters, actually explain what bariatric surgery is, because I'm sure a lot of listeners will maybe have a clue, but not really understand what it's all about.
Okay, so if we go back to that 2007 space, when I first started, I helped set up the first publicly funded, what we now call metabolic bariatric surgery. Previously, it was called weight loss surgery. And the thing about the surgery is it aids weight loss. However, it's a whole lot more than that. So what we now call metabolic surgery is because what we're actually working with is the chronic and often unremitting condition of the disease process of obesity. And it's a very loaded word. It's loaded in so many ways. There's so much bias associated with it. And we are, in fact, working with a metabolic condition rather than a person being in a bigger body. So metabolic or bariatric surgery or weight loss surgery is actually surgically shifting what's happening physically within either the stomach or the intestine, and it impacts the hormones associated with hunger, satiation, which impacts the brain, which then creates a whole lot of metabolic changes after we've touched the stomach. So there are actually many different methods of the surgery, but currently there are three key surgeries. So if I just go through the three key surgeries, and when I'm explaining it all to patients, I like to suggest that surgeons are always looking for the best technique. So they're shifting and moving them, and people get really confused. So is like a laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy, is that better than a Roux-en-Y or the new one loop anastomosis? Well, I'm having the new one loop anastomosis. And in truth, all of these different surgeries are techniques and are driven by A, the surgeon's skill set, B, what the patient really requires. So I think of them like cars. And if you think about the Roux-en-Y, which was the very first metabolic or weight loss surgery, and that was, I'm going to say about 1956, but I could have my date wrong, is what we call the gold standard. So we know how it works. It works very, very well. Yes, you get a smaller stomach that we call a pouch, but it is the cutting of the stomach that impacts the relationship between the brain and the body. So however we cut the stomach, whether you've got cancer or we're doing it for the metabolic outcomes, as soon as we cut the stomach, those hormones are impacted. So with your Roux-en-Y, you've got a pouch, and we have what's called two anastomoses, which means that the intestine is shifted, and the top part of your intestine is where you absorb all of your fat and your carbohydrates and your sugars. So by shifting the top part of the intestine, it becomes what's called a malabsorptive kind of procedure. So there's three things at play here. There's the metabolic change, there's the inability to metabolize certain types of foods particularly well, and the smallest of the pouch, which helps with the satiation. So all of those three things are what we call the gold standard. And that's what I like to call the Roux-en-Y a Volvo, because it's been around for a very long time. It's incredibly safe. We really, really know this operation inside out, and we know how it works. So if somebody is really in the big upper range of being in, and I don't like these words, but in sitting in the morbidly obese space, then a Roux-en-Y is our best option. Now, in the 2000s, they were struggling in America with the amount of patients who were exceeding levels that were safe to do what's called a Roux-en-Y. So they started doing a two-stage procedure, which was they did the sleeve. So what the sleeve is they take out 3/4 of the stomach, that goes in the bin, and your stomach turns into the shape of a sleeve, hence why it's called a sleeve. And what they were finding out is that many of these people that were having the sleeve didn't need to go on for the second operation to revise it into a Roux-en-Y. So the sleeve became like, oh, wow, this is as good as a Roux-en-Y. Obviously, evidence and research shows us that it's perhaps not as effective long-term as the Roux-en-Y is. However, I like to think of it as a Toyota. And I like to say to my clients that this is a really effective tool. And if we think about the difference between a Volvo and a Toyota, if you drive your Toyota incredibly well and you care for it, it may actually be as good or better than your Volvo. If you excuse my language, the shit out of your Volvo, it's actually not going to be as good as the Toyota. So yes, the operation is incredibly important, but how you work with it post-surgery, equally so. So recently there's been surgeons doing more I'm going to say tutuing around and like, oh, if we do this and we do that. So we have several surgeries that have been and gone. For example, a lot of people had what's called the gastric band. I like to think of the band as an Alfa Romeo because it spends a lot of time in the shop and it's not as effective as the others. But there's many people who still have effective bands out there. Australia did a lot more bands than we did, so we don't have the same situation with revising bands into Roux-en-Ys, but that's a situation. And the one that is coming up that I like to think of as the Tesla is called the one loop anastomosis. And so what it does is it decreases complications from having two anastomosis, which is two joins that potentially could become problems further down the line. So by limiting that to one, we decrease longer term complications. But what happens with the one loop anastomosis, it's a bit of a hybrid. It's got a sleeve shaped stomach, but the loop is much longer. So we have greater malabsorption. And again, this is relatively new, but because I work in the long-term care, I'm starting to see that the one loop anastomosis is still not quite as good as the Roux-en-Y because the bigger limb length means that we have slightly more malabsorption, which means that they require further follow-up than perhaps a Roux-en-Y. So the three different surgeries that we see are either a Roux-en-Y, a sleeve, or a one loop anastomosis. But there's also other ones out there that are in the offing. There's other surgeons trying different things. So for me, it's really important what the surgery is. And once I know what the surgery is, I'm going to make sure that they know how to drive their car, because often, and this is where I use the car analogy, is we get very used to driving our Mazda and we might not be driving it particularly well. The hormone component of metabolic bariatric surgery has a life of about 8 to 14 months. And so that's where we get a lot of the making lifestyle changes whilst the hormones are impacting the brain. So you don't feel physically hungry. Some of the head noise or the hedonic craving for food slows down. And this is where lots of people think that, oh my God, I've got this new car. I'm freaking sorted. I am amazing. This is what we call the honeymoon phase. But ultimately the brain, the human is very homeostatic, and the brain figures out that it's been tricked. And so it rewires and your physiological hunger comes back in. the cravings come back in. And so my job is very much about helping people learn to drive their Volvo in the specific way we need to drive a Volvo versus how they've always driven their Mazda. And in truth, the shall I say, the pathways, the habits, the things that are happening in our brain about how and why we drive the Mazda, they require slightly more than the physiological changes of the surgery. Does that explain it all?
That was an amazing explanation. Thank you very much. Oh my goodness. So there's a couple of things I picked up on that. One is about the malabsorption. I'm really interested to hear what does this mean for someone? I mean, we usually think of malabsorption as something quite bad. You know, they're going to be deficient of nutrients and good fats and things like that. What is done for these people after they've had the surgery to actually support? I mean, you know, I'm really big on nutrition, and I'm thinking malabsorption, very bad. What happens for these people afterwards?
Okay. So Helen, this is why I do what I do, because that's it in a nutshell. Is when we look at the risk. So where somebody is sitting with metabolic disease process, they're stuck. They're in a really awful place, and an awful place in a way that many of us can't understand. They're stuck psychologically, they're stuck physically, and obesity is an incredibly complex condition. And one of the things that everyone asks me is, well, why don't these people just eat less and move more? And obesity, when we flip over into metabolic obesity, what that means is our adipose tissue has hit a certain point, which means that a whole lot of metabolic changes are taking over. So things like exercise, we can now see that if somebody's adipose tissue is sitting at a certain percent, and here's where it gets complicated, it's not the same for everybody. Different cultural groups, different races, different genes express this differently. So that point is not, your BMI is not a helpful scale for this, okay? So different races have protection, others don't. So when we flip over into the metabolic space, what's actually happening is no amount of exercise and movement is going to change the body composition, okay? So the kind of people that I get will say, but I've exercised and dieted all my life and it makes no difference. So on the exercise side, it's because of the adipose tissue and other complex metabolic pathways. But on the food side, most people that I work with have done multiple diets. And when we start suppressing the amount of food that we're eating, we shift and we do other metabolic changes. So many of my clients are already malnourished before I even meet them, because many of their diets have been, well, you name it. They're doing keto, they're fasting, they've done Weight Watchers for years, they've done Sure Slim. They've actually lowered their base level of the amount of nutrients they get to sometimes around about 1,000 calories a day. Now that puts anyone who's doing that into an energy deficit, and you cannot maintain those kinds of energy deficits. So it's a combination of what's happening metabolically that shifts people into not being able to lose weight. So I'm really heartened when I've just finished reading Stacey Sims' book, her second book, Next Level. I'm really heartened to hear someone like Stacey Sims saying this is not about weight. This is actually about body composition. This is actually about absorbing nutrients and making sure you eat whole food. In truth, dieting and suppressing your calorific intake is what, in fact, flips you into the metabolic disease. So most of my clients are already in a nutrient deficiency already. So that has massive impact, both psychologically and physiologically. So many of my clients are depressed. They're depressed because of bias associated to skinny is good, fat is bad. And so they internalize that they're not worthy. So there's a huge area. they're depressed because their B12 is absolutely in their boots. Their iron, they come to me with irons of about 18 and tell me that they really struggle with sleep and they don't like getting out of bed, and they've internalized that as well. So in truth, before people even have metabolic bariatric surgery, they are already metabolically, nutritionally in a big world of hurt. So what we actually do is we create a reset. And the teams that work with, and this was my role once upon a time, not now, but the teams that wrap around the surgeon provide intense nutritional support and psychological support as we refigure somebody's digestive tract. And, you know, in the early days post-surgery, particularly for the first 6 months or year, they have a team that is allowing them to make lifestyle changes and to really ensure that we protect muscle, that we get the right amount of nutrients in. So if there's one thing that anybody's hearing me, you know, supplementation, there's a lot to be said about supplementation, but if somebody has had their stomach surgically altered and we have dropped their calorific intake and we essentially put them in a catabolic state, they need to take metabolic bariatric multivitamins for the rest of their life, because things like iron, calcium, zinc, vitamin D, B12, B6, molybdenum, we are actually putting people into a malabsorptive space. So therefore, we have to really care for what people's nutrients are. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I was just thinking about the whole vitamin D thing, because I understand that people with bigger bodies are more likely to be deficient in vitamin D. And actually, there's a real high correlation between low vitamin D levels and mental health disorders as well. So you can even just see how these circular things start to happen in someone's life, and how difficult it is to reverse these, or, you know, put the right support or the right techniques. I mean, obviously bariatric surgery is doing a lot. It's not just helping people to be slim.
And that's a really important thing, because that's the bias, right? The bias is that people are having the surgery and that's the cheat's way out. But once somebody flips into metabolic, what we call weight cycling, no amount of diet and exercise is going to shift this. So, you know, in your bio of me, in 2007, I really, really, really wondered if we were doing the lobotomy of the 2000s. And I was really nervous about what we were doing. But it didn't take very long for me to recognize that metabolic bariatric surgery is, in fact, best practice for the chronic condition of obesity. Unfortunately, that's not a message that we hear often, because of that overriding noise of that whole bias that comes from the environment that we live in, that tells us that skinny is significantly more healthy than being in a bigger body. And nothing is black and white. You know, life is way more messy than that. And there are really times when being in a bigger body with great muscle composition, and there's nothing wrong with your bloods, you don't actually sit on the obese scale. So a really amazing guy in Canada set up this thing called the Edmonton Obesity Scale. And that is a much better way of assessing where a person might be in their space with a bigger body. So, and now we have GLP-1s that are making a huge big splash, not so much here in New Zealand, but watch the space, because this is an enormous game changer. And what I know is that the science associated with obesity in New Zealand and out in like normal literature is about 10 years behind. And so you've got someone like me who's been geeking out about it for 17 years, and a whole lot of GPs now just having to come on board because they can start prescribing GLP-1s, and they bring with them, and this is not disrespectful, but they bring no understanding of obesity and assume that it's because they're patients. And I heard this from a GP the other day. Well, it's because she was eating cashews all day thinking that was healthy. And yeah, like the judgment and is huge because GPs, new doctors, they're not actually talking about the specialty of obesity and its complexities. So yeah, that's it's big. It's really
Yeah.
big.
And I suppose that brings me to the next question, Kate. And I know that you don't have an answer to this, but I know that people often will ask this. What causes obesity?
Oh goodness. You know, I have an hour-long session for that one. But what I will say is it's incredibly multifactorial. And you know, I'll give you a list. Yes, your genes have an impact. So latest count, there's somewhere between 300 and 600 genes that will impact whether you will actually have adiposity or you'll put on weight. So some people literally do not have genes that is going to predispose them to laying down adipose tissue. So your genes really have an impact. That age-old question, your environment, how you grew up, the things that you learned, your culture, these all have an impact. ACEs, adverse childhood events, enormous. And so I'm not sure if you're aware, and I don't want to teach you to suck eggs, but Vincent Vincenti, who is the guy who did all the research around adverse childhood events, was in fact an obesity specialist. And it was because he had a client who kept weight cycling that he actually started to look at the adverse childhood events. And so we know that somebody who has 4 or more adverse childhood events has a significantly greater chance of ending up in a bigger body and actually moving into the chronic condition of obesity. And I read a book very recently that was talking about the New Zealand Dunedin study, and it put together the Dunedin study and a twin study that is happening over in the United Kingdom at the moment. And they had twins, and they could see that some children, one twin was being bullied and one wasn't. And what they were noticing is that twin's waist circumference was bigger than the non-twin. So they could see that the family situation was the same, culturally they were the same, genetically they were the same. So they followed them, and they keep following them because it's a longitudinal study, and they looked into what the Dunedin study calls their pantry, and they got out all of the Dunedin studies stuff around bullying, waist circumference, height, BMI, etc. And they found that every child that had been bullied had a greater waist circumference and higher BMI than their twin. So it's fundamentally really complex. It is simply not about the food that we put in our mouth and the exercise that we do. And I'm going to say that food and exercise are really important pillars of obesity care, but they are not the answer.
So interesting, isn't it? I think that whole impact of adverse childhood events and stress, which obviously are very similar, and how it promotes that response of, they often talk about stress response promoting more adipose tissue around the internal organs. At least that's what I've heard. So it's almost like a very primal response to stress.
Oh, absolutely. You've got 2 things going on there, Helen. You've got the cortisol response from the allostatic load, but then you've also got, and this is the chicken and the egg. What comes first? The allostatic load that creates the craving, the desire to actually avoid life as it is, or yeah, you know, and I don't know you're right, I don't know the answer to that, but if we're having any conversations with anybody who is in a bigger body, then we actually have to understand that food has more than one function, and it's not just about providing nutrients. And so when we drop into diet culture that suppresses food, that we fast, that we put the body into the starvation response, we will undoubtedly create a binge response and end up having the dopamine impact of high fat and high sugar, which becomes a soothing component. So it's really complex.
It is, isn't it? And fasting itself is a stress response. So yes, fasting works very well for some people. They cope with it really well. It helps them to lose weight, all that sort of thing. For other people, it's like the worst thing you can do because it's just adding to the stress and you're just creating more stress in your body. So it's so, I find all this cookie, I'm going to blame Instagram and social media, but the cookie cutter advice that, oh, you just do this and this is this is what's right for you. And it's so individual, and we cannot just assume that everybody is going to do well by fasting or whatever the dietary advice might be.
And you can metabolic bariatric surgery is part of that as well. And I have my favorite saying is when I'm at conferences or I'm presenting is we have to meet our client or patient where they're at, not where we think they need to go and what our lovely little moment of, oh, I've just read this and this particular thing's changed. We actually need to do a full assessment and meet our client where they're at. And in today's health environment, we have 15 minutes in a GP's office to meet our client where they're at. And very frequently, people who are suffering from metabolic obesity, they are very complex patients that require a lot of time for them to feel seen and heard. And we just put that cookie cutter stuff on top of it and makes it even worse. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So I'm just going to go back. You were working at Middlemore Hospital at Counties Manukau DHB, and you stated that you were sort of noticing that something was missing about the care that people were receiving. And this, I understand, led you to start your own business. Do you want to talk a little bit around that and what you've done since then? What sort of learnings and courses and things, which actually have really crossed paths on my course. So it's interesting that Kate started off in sort of surgical bariatric nursing. I've been mental health nursing, and at one stage we had a conversation. We realised our paths had completely crossed or come together. So it's interesting how this has all come about over the years.
It's kind of like it's a confluence of. I was very much a surgical kind of nurse, and came in to becoming a bariatric nurse specialist because I had done an endurance event and had got incredibly fit and had worked in Counties Manukau in many other roles prior to becoming a bariatric nurse specialist, but I'd done an Ironman, and so I was really fit and I felt like I had a good understanding of nutrition and exercise and blah. Really, I look at that person and I'm embarrassed. But I kind of wanted to help people to feel that sense of accomplishment and health and wellness in reality. And I was well known for starting things up. Like I was good at starting things. And so this was totally, it was all the things came together in one great space. And it was about a year before I started to notice that there was a whole lot missing. There wasn't just the psychological component, and unfortunately counties took a very long time to understand that there was a psychological component. So as a nurse, I got very curious and I spent a lot of time looking at that. But the thing that really changed my world was when I started to understand the impact of shame. And so here I was, 182 centimeters, 78 kilograms, endurance athlete, fit as all hell, having people who were 160 kgs, having to stand on scales that admittedly were really great, that went up to 300 kgs. But there was an enormous component of shame here. And once I understood that there was an absolute disconnect between myself and my clients, and it was that comparison, and it was my hubris and my arrogance, I figured I need to do something about that, because if I was going to connect and really allow people to actually have autonomy and care for themselves, it needed to stop being prescriptive and it really needed to be therapeutic. So I had a lot of work to do on myself to be able to allow people to feel comfortable and seen in all of my privilege. So I basically had to do this enormous 180, give myself a massive uppercut, and really actually dig deep into understanding all of that stuff that is what creates obesity. And so what I saw was missing is that in the surgical component, and we can do it, we think about it in childbirth as well, is we provide this amazing tool. So think about a surgeon as a obstetrician or a midwife. We deliver the baby, we do it safely, we do a really good job, we do all this antenatal stuff. And then, oh, look, we've got this great baby, and isn't it wonderful? And out the door you go. And so, when the baby starts becoming a bit problematic and not doing what the parents thought it was going to do, and you go back to the obstetrician or the midwife, they're going to say, well, that's actually not my job. And what I discovered is that we had in all our wisdom started this amazing process, but we didn't actually have that next step, that what happens when it goes wrong. And of course it's going to go wrong because we've actually just delivered a baby and there's way more associated with this. So I started to bang on about we needed to teach GPs about how to care for these people that we were putting out into primary care. Unfortunately, public health systems don't work like that. So I found myself banging my head against a brick wall and ultimately realizing that no one was actually going to do what I felt they needed to do, and that no one ended up becoming me.
Yeah.
So I stepped out into that space to provide that support that I still think is so very important. And the GLP-1s are going to come along, and the GLP-1s essentially do very similar stuff to the surgery. The head stuff's not going to change whether you take medication or you have surgery. So that hasn't changed. We can do the prescribing, but we still need to provide support in what we call the 4 pillars associated with obesity, which is behavioral, which is nutrition, which is physical, and the other tool of medical intervention. They're 4 pillars, but they need to be wrapped together. And what we have is a whole lot of babies being delivered without that wraparound service. So that's what I set out to do.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. And are you the only person in the country doing this service?
Since I started, a lot of the surgeons have provided much greater wraparound care. And, I'm very grateful for that. But we also have to remember we have a lot of patients who can't afford surgery in New Zealand, and our public system is so far behind with any public surgery now because of COVID and where we are with our health system. Many people are going offshore. They're going to Mexico. They're going to Turkey. They're going to Thailand. And they're having their babies in Thailand and zero support. And I'm going to say I don't condone people going offshore. I certainly understand it. I have a lot of empathy and compassion for it. And I'm kind of happy to be that safety net for them, because if they don't have a safety net, I know what happens, and that's really not okay.
Yeah. There's so much to it, isn't it? The more I hear you speak, the more I hear about how much of this is psychological, mental, spiritual, even, if we think about the whole component. And as you say, there's real misguided beliefs around obesity, people in bigger bodies, and I totally hear you about the shame side of that. So I think you're doing amazing work, and I know that people are going to be really thrilled to hear that someone is picking up this baby. Actually,
Helen, can I pick you up on one thing there? Like you summed that up beautifully, but there's one more component, and that is often the loss of weight and or the loss of the requirement of food that has actually had a function. Okay, so here in New Zealand, we work with whare tapa whā, which I really love. And I think about the surgical and the nutrition and the physical component as that physical wall on the whare tapa whā. But think about, you said spiritual, so there's the wairua, but let's think about whanau and connection. So food has an enormous function within connection And we know that statistically, people who have really good connection are actually the people who live longer. So when we provide a surgical tool or a medical tool that takes away the ability for people to connect through food, that requires real support. And then we go around to the other wall, which is the emotional, psychological. And if food has the function of actually providing me with my ability to function, to actually get through life. So that's really where my research impacted, is because I discovered two key things: that if somebody doesn't feel they have worth or value, then they won't care for themselves. So many of the people who sit in bigger bodies are sitting in shame. They don't have a sense of worth. They don't even come forward for surgery because they think, well, why bother? So the ones that choose to move forward for surgery have a sense of like, well, I'm worth more than this. And so they make the choice to make the change. But then we take away the self-soothing component of how they're actually functioning, and all hell can break loose. And I've seen that on many, many occasions, that when we take away the one thing that is actually allowing people to function. So if we think about alcohol as an addiction, and we call people functioning alcoholics, in truth, some people are functioning in life because the dopamine hit that they get from food is in fact their drug of choice. And if we understand what Eckhart Tolle says about addiction begins in pain and ends in pain, we have just opened up a can of worms. So when I'm with my clients, I'm working in all four. I'm going to say not so much the spiritual. It's not really, as a nurse, it's probably my weakest area, and so it should be. But I'm working in all three pillars of that whare tapa whā, and we have to deal with which one is creating the biggest sort of problem and get that whole whare up and standing. And often there's some pretty shaky foundations.
Yeah. And I love that Te Whare Tapa Whā model also, because underneath all that is the environment. And people often forget about that. And I'm just like, hang on a minute, what else are we dealing with here? So I think that it is a lovely, lovely model, and it's great to see that you've been able to use that as part of the work you do.
It fits really nicely for my clients. And when you asked what causes obesity, well, it's all of that stuff, and that's, for many people, their whare is pretty shaky and their environment underneath is actually not great when they go into surgery, and then they become a new person and look at me, and that I have a name for it, and I talk to my clients about it, and it's followed me, and it's not very nice, but I call it the mind fuckery of weight loss surgery. And there is a lot of it, because your whole identity for other people has shifted because of that bias, right? So, oh, wow, like I can think of hundreds and hundreds of examples of where people realized how much they've been sidelined and not seen because of the bias. And so when they look better for other people, but they haven't changed, essentially, this is a crazy ride for people. And they didn't expect it. They just were like, oh, I'm going to be healthy and I'm going to be well. And up opens this whole crazy ride that they were not expecting. And that's very much my paddling pool.
Yeah, that is absolutely fantastic. I'm going to ask a question, because I know that there's a lot of talk, and I'm slightly sidelining here. What do you know about the impact of ultra-processed foods? Because this is something that's really coming up now, and I know, sorry, Kate, but the impact of ultra-processed foods on obesity. Are you happy to speak a little bit about that? We don't have to speak for very long, but I just think it's really important to put out there, because I think people forget about the quality. There's the quantity, but there's the quality of the food that we put in our mouths.
I think I would like to so there's a guy called Kevin Hall, who is an obesity researcher and has been enormous in this field. And he was the one that kind of let us really know that when people flip over into this whole metabolic space, that they're not going to flip out. So Kevin Hall's really, he's very sentinel in this space. He's now doing a lot of research around ultra-processed food. And he's sort of swimming against the tide a little bit, because he's saying, hang on a minute, every time we demonize stuff, we make things black and white. Now, absolutely, I am a complete component for whole food. You cannot get better nutrients than what you get from all forms of whole food, fruit, vegetables. This has totally been my paddling pool for a very long time. And I really work very hard to encourage people who've had metabolic bariatric surgery to have a whole food diet. But because we have actually altered their digestive tract surgically, they need the backstop of actually supplementation. So that's why they're different to people who are just working on how can they be as healthy as they can with a whole food diet, and that processed food, we want to avoid it. But for my cohort, obviously there needs to be some processed food in there, because I need to be really helping muscle. I don't want people to have sarcopenia. I really want to be protecting all of that really good stuff. And sometimes the processed food is the easiest way that I can get that in, so that I can make sure that people are really, really healthy. So I'm not going to say that processed food is not great, like in the ultra processed space, right? But as a way of nourishing and nurturing yourself, not great, but it has a place. Does that answer?
Yeah. So you're more talking about, a protein powder might be very important, for example, or
Yes.
but as opposed to a food that is, I want to say Twinkies, but I know we don't even have Twinkies in New Zealand. But, as opposed to a food that actually hardly even has food in it. So they're very ultra processed, not really recognisable as food.
Yeah. And, a lot of my clients are in fact addicted to that.
Yeah. The hyper palatable, the ones that will spike your blood sugar levels and then drop, so you crave more of them. The dopamine peaks and drop. That sort of ultra processed food is kind of, I guess, that definition, isn't it? That's tricky.
Yeah.
Ultra processed versus processed, and yeah.
And a lot of people want certainty. A lot of people want to blame something as to why we have so much more obesity today than what we had, say, in the 1950s. And yes, I'm going to say that ultra-processed, hyper-palatable food is a part of the picture, but it's not the whole picture. Okay, so again, when we demonize something, I don't know how many times I've been at parties and people say, oh, what do you do? And I tell them, oh, well, and they've got this total theory that all we have to do is get rid of all of the McDonald's on every corner, and that's going to solve the obese problem. It's not. It's a small component. And, something like a sugar tax. I'm not against a sugar tax. However, we actually have to look at equity, because equity in the food environment, a lot of people think that obesity is a lower socioeconomic problem. It looks like it's a lower socioeconomic problem because the people who can not afford to have metabolic bariatric surgery to come and talk to somebody like me have massive amounts of marketing and 4 of those kinds of outlets on their corner. So it's cheaper. It's the only food that they can afford. And the people who can afford to have surgery have had surgery. They haven't told anybody that they've had metabolic surgery. And so when people say, so what are you doing? They say, oh, just eating less and moving more. So they completely keep that whole myth going. And so it looks really skewed. So I'm going to say, let's not demonize things, and let's understand that equity sits underneath all of this. So if people were able to afford really good whole foods, full stop, I think we would see a shift. But a lot of those processed foods are in fact the only thing that some people can afford.
Yeah, I did when I was looking at the nutrition and mental health, I got out a map, and so this was in South Auckland, and I drew like a 5 kilometre radius, and I counted all the fast food places in that area and counted how many supermarkets were in that area. Like, where could you get fresh food? And honestly, there were probably 10 to 15 fast food outlets, and I think there was one like Asian style fresh and vegetable shop in that area.
Yeah.
And I
And
was
when
just
we
like,
used to talk about that because, when I worked at Counties, that was the environment that my clients were working in. And when we have privilege, when we think about that person that I said that I was, how much privilege did I have? Like, I could actually buy a bike and do an Ironman. I could buy salmon, but many of my clients, they did not have the ability to be in such a privileged position. And you talk about that Auckland scenario. So you go from Counties Manukau, Middlemore Hospital, and then say go across town to Mission Bay. And how many delicatessens with beautiful salads and whole foods are in the same radius? So yeah, I don't disagree that hyperpalatable food is not great. However, it's not particularly about the food. And so much of where I sit, it's not about the food. And so many well-meaning people will tell my clients that all you need to do is this when they have no concept of the deep complexity. And as I said earlier, meet your patient or your client where they're at, because again, obesity actually doesn't, it sits right across every single demographic. It's just different demographics have ability to deal with it than other demographics, which is skewing it for the average person who already has a significant explicit bias that people in bigger bodies are just blah, blah, blah. Like I had a client, not yesterday, the day before, who was telling me her story about going to her GP. She had, they had something in their water. They were on a farm and they had something in their water. And so she needed a certain kind of antibiotics. The GP had not actually met, and she was a locum, and she had not actually met this person's children. And the GP said that, what would solve your problem if you stop putting sugar in your tea and not letting your children have lollies and fizzy? Now, this woman was really devastated because she actually was providing her family and herself with a fully whole food diet. And when we look at this woman's blood work, she actually was in a really good metabolic state, even though she had a BMI of 45. So we as healthcare professionals create quite a lot of problems when our explicit bias comes out and we say really dumb stuff.
that breaks my heart a little bit, Kate. That,
major
yeah,
problems.
that,
And I hear this on the daily, Helen. Do you know the biggest part of my job is to actually be present and hold space for somebody to be able to recognize that I am going to see the whole person, not make judgment, and allow them to tell their stories. And that, I can't tell you how big a shift from the nurse that was like, oh, Jean Schmeens, what a load of bollocks, to from the nurse who was on a surgical ward or working in trauma, as in physical trauma, and somebody was not coping with it, ringing the psych team.
no, that's me.
Yeah, this is where we've completely,
Yeah,
I'm
isn't it
now the
amazing?
psych team. I'm now able to just meet people where they are and see them. And I know that sounds really new agey, but that's the first thing that I am sometimes the first healthcare professional who hasn't blamed them for their weight. And that actually that's the first cab off the rank. So everyone who works for me in Te Aki Whaiaro, I am the only one who has not either had surgery or is using medication. And I know that the lived experience can impact the therapeutic relationship, but when a client is able to understand that their healthcare professional has experienced the same biases, those people are further down. I have to prove myself, but those of my staff who don't have to do that, they've got an in that I don't have. So in this space, we cannot discount the bias against people in bigger bodies. It's a very real thing.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
And I would say that I only scratched the surface. There is thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who have had this surgery. And once they start to regain, which is an inevitability, like we expect that all people who have surgery will have some regain because we're working with a chronic condition. So of course that's going to happen. But that shame component drives people underground because they don't want to come back and have help because they've internalized that it's their fault. I don't know how to get to those people, but I know that they are out there and there's a lot of them.
Okay. Oh, amazing. Tell us, where can people find you?
Just Google my name, and up comes my business, which is Te Aki Whaiaro, and I do 99% of my work via telehealth, and I have a workshop. I do a lot of workshops, so I do in front of people. I have quite small workshops of 4 people, but I also do big workshops of up to 60, 80 people. So my website, Facebook, Instagram, but I'm not so good with the social media. I have to say it's not my strong point.
And that's absolutely fine. I think that's quite wise, actually, Kate. Social media could be quite challenging.
And also given what I work with, right?
Exactly.
I have experienced some interesting trolling in the past.
Yeah.
I'm a bit wary about that kind of stuff, but I think I probably need to embrace it at some point.
All in good time, I'm sure. Any last words? Anything else that you want to add? I think this has just been such a powerful and incredible conversation.
Thank you. I think the hope component, and it's a really important thing, is we have made such incredible strides in understanding the complexity of obesity, and there is a lot of treatment out there. And so my real hope is that people can embrace treatment as we would embrace any other kind of healthcare treatment that is increasing our potential, and to not be afraid of. I'm actually, that's really tricky. To not be afraid of actually doing our own homework and advocating for ourselves, self-advocacy and self-efficacy, and recognizing that that being in a bigger body isn't anything to do with you personally. It's much bigger than that. And there is absolutely help out there for it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful way to finish today. Thank you so much for your time, Kate. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Sense of Hope podcast. And gosh, I'm going to keep a close eye on your work, and I'm looking forward to what's coming up next for you.
Thank you. Thank you.